The hearing will please come to order. Our next witness is Mr. Albert Hakim. Mr. Hakim, will you please rise? Raise your right hand. Do you, Albert Hakim, solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do.
Please be seated.
Thank you.
Mr. Hakim, you are accompanied by your counsel. For the record, will you introduce them?
Mr. Richard Janis and Mr. Larry Wexler, further left.
Mr. Hakim, at an earlier phase of our investigation, after it appeared that you would assert your constitutional privilege against self-incrimination, the Senate and the House Select Committees obtained orders of the United States District Court. The orders provide in substance that you may not refuse to testify on the basis of your privilege against self-incrimination. The immunity orders have been communicated to you previously, and you have already given testimony to our committee pursuant to them. Your testimony today will also be under those continuing grants of immunity. The previously communicated immunity orders are available at the witness table, and copies will be placed in the record of these hearings. Without objection, so ordered. Any statement? Who will be on first? Chair recognizes John Niels.
Chairman, I've been informed that the witness has a brief opening statement that he wishes to make.
Mr. Hakim, please proceed, sir.
Was he sworn?
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to be able to appear before you today to discuss my role in the matters under investigation. Like you, I'm anxious that the full story of this affair can be disclosed to the Congress and to the American people so that everyone can judge for himself what has taken place and can consider the important issues raised by these hearings. I'm also hopeful that the committee's questions will lead to a full revelation of my own involvement in this affair. Over the last 6 months, my family and I have had to withstand public attention and accusations difficult for anyone to bear. I have been variously described as everything from a mastermind to a shadowy figure. My reputation has been assaulted, and I have even been referred to in thinly veiled ethnic slurs. As will become clear during my testimony, my participation in this matter was a result of a variety of motives. Not only was I presented with an opportunity to help my country, the United States, and my native land, Iran, but at the same time, I had the opportunity to profit financially. As a businessman, I never pretended to undertake the tasks I was asked to perform for philanthropic purposes, and I made that clear to all of those with whom I was involved, including General Secord, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, the CIA, and the Iranians. At the same time, I never would have gotten involved in these efforts if I had thought them illegal or contrary to the policies of the United States government. When I first was asked by General Secord to assist with the Contra effort, I understood that he had obtained legal advice from a prestigious Washington law firm confirming the legality of our activities. I was also aware that General Secord himself had substantial experience in the U.S. government, including experience dealing with the laws regarding sale of weapons. Since I trusted and still trust General Secord implicitly, I was confident when he gave me his own assurance regarding the legality of our activities. Finally, I was told that our Contra activities were being undertaken not only with approval by, but at the request of the President of the United States. We were dealing directly with the White House staff. Consequently, it never occurred to me as a private citizen independently to investigate the legality of the President's policy. With respect to Iran initiative, the same basic facts are also true. I intended to profit from my activities, and I never made any pretense about that fact. Moreover, I had the same assurances regarding the legality of our efforts, and I was told that the President of the United States had personally signed an order authorizing our activities. During the course of our efforts, I had frequent dealings with government officials in the CIA, the DEA, and the President's National Security Council. I received substantial official support for my activities, and I attended numerous meetings with these officials, including a number of meetings at the White House. Under those circumstances, I had no reason to believe that my activities could have been in any way improper or contrary to U.S. policy. The Iran initiative also afforded me a unique opportunity to combine financial self-interest with the pursuit of a personal and political interest of great importance to me. I was born, raised, and formerly operated substantial businesses in Iran. I'm attached to that land and its people. I hoped and understood that one of the purposes of our efforts was to establish relationships that ultimately could lead to an end to the terrible toll in human bloodshed being suffered by the people of Iran and Iraq. I also hoped and understood that our efforts would assist the United States government to obtain the release of American hostages and, more important in the long term, to enable the United States to reestablish normal relations with a country whose geopolitical importance is undisputable. As a private businessman and as a naturalized American citizen devoted to this country, I considered it an honor to be called upon by the office of the President of the United States to render meaningful assistance to my country. I'm now prepared to answer your questions and assure you that I will do my best to answer them candidly. There may be times when you will have to be patient with me, however, for although I believe that I speak English well, it is not my native language, as I believe your staff came to understand during 5 long days of deposition. This can occasionally result in miscommunications or misunderstandings, but such miscommunications and misunderstandings, once identified, will be clarified. Thank you.
Mr. Niels.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Hakim, I take it you are an Iranian-born businessman,
That's correct, Mr. Niels.
and you are just over 50 years old.
That's correct.
And I take it that you lived in Tehran and were raised there until you were approximately 20 years old.
That's also correct.
And at that time you came to this country for education and spent 1 year at high school in San Luis Obispo
That's correct.
And then you spent 3 years at California State Polytechnic College,
Approximately.
as it was then called.
That's correct.
And for financial reasons, you were then forced to return to Iran.
Yes, that was during Dr. Amini's work, yes.
I think it would be a good idea if you moved the microphone about 6 inches further towards you.
Is this better now?
That's much better. Thank you, Mr. Hakim. And that was in approximately 1959.
That is correct.
And soon thereafter, you went into business in Iran.
That is also correct.
And you were associated with a company called Multicorp.
That is correct.
I should have mentioned first a company called Telecom.
For the first 9 years, that's right.
That was Telecom.
Telecom Limited, yes.
And Telecom was in the business of marketing the products of U.S. manufacturers of electronic equipment to the government of Iran.
That is correct. That's what they did then.
And then you started your own company called Multicorp.
That's right.
And that was in approximately 1972.
That's also correct.
And Multicorp was in roughly the same business as Telecom.
Roughly.
And I take it Multicorp was quite successful and grew to have approximately 150 employees.
At one point, we had 150 employees. That's correct.
Sometime in the mid-1970s, you acquired a second residence in France, just outside of Geneva, Switzerland.
That's also correct.
And you started businesses in your second home.
Well, expanded basically the same business that I had in Multicorp out of there. You're correct.
You started a company called Stanford Technology S.A.
That was one of the companies I established there in Geneva.
And it had a subsidiary, Stanford Technology USA, in California.
That's also correct.
And the California company was engaged in the business of selling communication systems equipment to the government of Iran.
And also manufacturing.
And I take it there came a time in approximately 1978 when, for personal reasons, you moved your principal residence to California.
Yes, I moved from Europe to California.
And your father and sisters already lived there, and I take it it was for personal reasons that you moved.
That's correct, Mr. Niels.
And shortly thereafter, the revolution occurred in Iran.
That is also right.
And essentially terminated much of your business activities, including all of your business activities in Iran.
That's also correct.
However, I take it as of that time you had acquired substantial personal assets as a result of the earnings of Multicorp and your other businesses.
You're right.
And during the next 5 years or so, you also received some benefit from the sale of a subsidiary of Stanford Technology USA.
That's correct.
But other than that, I take it after the revolution, your business activities, other than this one sale of the subsidiary, were losing propositions.
You're very correct.
I take it that you continue to live in California today.
You're right.
You know, I take it, a man named General Secord.
Yes, sir.
And you met him first in Iran in the 1970s.
That's correct, sir.
And I take it from what you've told us in deposition testimony prior to today that Mr. General Secord was instrumental in your losing a very lucrative contract with the Iranian Air Force.
That's also correct.
And I take it you also had dealings with General Secord in connection with the hostages, the U.S. Embassy hostages in Iran.
Initially with him and later on with a different segment of the U.S. government.
Would you very briefly describe the events in connection with these hostages that caused you to come into contact with General Secord?
This was prior to my becoming an American citizen. I was honored only in 1984 to become an American citizen. General Secord, knowing that I had substantial contacts in Iran and to that date I still maintained Multicorp, He called me to meet with him in his office in the Pentagon, and very openly asked me if I was going to be ready to help out with the release of American hostages in Tehran, and I offered to help out. And from there on, I believe it was the Air Force intelligence people who continued their contact with me.
I take it you kept in contact with General Secord from time to time throughout the early 1980s.
You're right, sir.
And that was during the period when General Secord was employed by the U.S. government.
That's correct.
And I take it that one of the reasons was that you knew that General Secord had good contacts in Saudi Arabia, and you thought if he ever left the government, you and he might be able to make some money together.
That's right. General Secord enjoys a lot of respect in Saudi Arabia, amongst other Arab countries.
And when you found out sometime in 1983 that General Secord had left the U.S. government, I take it you approached him and asked him to become your business partner.
Effectively, yes. Effectively, you're right.
And you set up a company called Stanford Technology Trading Group International, which we will call STTGI, in which you and General Secord each had a 50% share.
The company was already established maybe a month or so earlier, and it was not active, but your conclusion is correct, Mr. Leach. We became 50-50 partners.
And it thereafter maintained offices in Vienna, Virginia, near where General Secord lives.
That's correct.
And I take it the business of STTGI was and was intended to be the marketing of products of U.S. manufacturing companies overseas, and principally to foreign governments.
That was the focus.
I take it you know a man named Willard Zucker,
Yes, I do, sir.
and he lives in Geneva,
Yes, he does.
Switzerland,
That's correct.
and he owns a company, or so far as you're aware, he owns a company known as CSF,
That's correct.
and that's a Swiss fiduciary company.
That's also correct.
And I take it a Swiss fiduciary company is a company which provides a number of services which would include opening bank accounts in Switzerland for its clients,
That's one of the functions they perform,
set up corporations,
if so required by the clients, yes.
particularly offshore corporations,
Not limited to that.
and they manage money for their clients.
That's the basic activity of theirs.
Take money of clients and invest them and to make decisions about how the money should be invested.
You're correct.
And they also provide accounting, tax, and legal services.
Only to their own clients.
And I take it that you, in fact, were a client of CSF in the 1970s when you maintained a residence and conducted business in the Geneva area.
You're correct, sir.
But I take it you are by no means CSF's only client.
Definitely not. Definitely.
And I think you've already testified that based on published material that you have seen about CSF, at least at certain periods of time, they have managed as much as $60 to $70 million in assets of their various clients.
Equivalent of that amount in various currencies, yes.
Now, I take it that you remained a client of CSF, but it would be fair to say that as of the period 1983 or so, you no longer kept more than a token amount of money in any Swiss bank accounts.
You're correct, sir.
Now, did there come a time after you and Mr. Secord went into business together, and I'm directing your attention now to late 1984 or early 1985, when he told you that he had been asked to help the freedom fighters in Nicaragua?
Yes, sir.
And Who did he say had asked him to do that?
Effectively, the President of the United States.
If you can give us a little bit more specifically what he said.
He mentioned that the White House had approached him to see if he would be willing to assist with the Nicaraguan initiative, and since he had already an obligation to me as a partner, he did not want to give an answer without rectifying his relationship with me, and at the same time invited me to join him.
What did he say he was asked to do precisely?
He was not very specific at the beginning. I believe he himself did not know quite well the extent of the mission.
Did he shortly thereafter tell you that he was asked to procure arms for the Contras?
Yes, there was a time that he told me that he was asked to procure non-American weapons.
And did you inquire as to whether there was some profit in this?
Yes, I did.
And what did he tell you?
The answer was yes, definitely yes.
And was that profit to take the form of commissions or markup?
In the form of commission, and he made it very clear to me that it will not be the normal markup and commission that in this type of business is used. We have to operate with a much lower percentage.
Did he mention a percentage or an approximate percentage that you would, a profit that you would make on these arms?
Well, we didn't get into that type of discussion. He said that he had to see how much you could purchase the material for, what the budget was, and if the customer could afford it. He basically asked me to leave it up to him to decide what to do, which I willingly did.
You agreed to go into this business venture with him?
Yes.
And I take it you and he thereafter acquired weapons and provided them to the Contras and made a profit?
That's correct, sir.
And approximately what was the profit?
You're speaking about the percentage? Or
yes, percentage, not absolute number, percentage.
The percentage from what General Secord told me, because I really didn't know what the costs were. He was handling that. He led me to believe that it would average out to something between 20 to 30%, depending on how you would look at it, whether you include the transportation or not include the transportation. But that was the approximate figure that he gave me.
And initially, were the arms acquired through a Canadian arms dealer?
Yes, sir.
And did the Canadian arms dealer share in a percentage of the commission?
The majority of it.
And did you and Mr. Secord split the remainder 50-50?
That's correct.
And did there come a later time when you ceased doing business through this Canadian arms dealer?
That's also correct.
And did you begin doing business through someone named Tom Kleins?
We effectively employed Mr. Tom Kleins to replace the Canadian arms dealer.
And did Mr. Kleins share in the commissions?
Yes, he did.
And did he get a smaller percentage than the Canadian arms dealer had gotten?
Definitely.
And did you and General Secord continue to share the remainder of the commission?
You're correct, sir.
And I take it that you, in fact, acquired arms and provided them to the Contras, taking this commission from approximately January of 1985 until approximately August of 1986.
That's correct.
Had you ever previously been involved in the purchase and sale of arms?
Effectively, the answer is no, Mr. Niels. My concentration has always been in high technology, electronics. There was a case which had to do with Winchester Olin, which I was asked to handle the account for a different person related to the officials of the government then. So outside of that, which I consider it was not my own activity, I never dealt with weapons and arms before.
Did there come a time in the fall of 1985 when General Secord told you that he had been asked to do an additional kind of activity for the Contras?
Yes, he did.
And did that involve what has been referred to in these hearings as the Contra resupply operation?
That's correct, sir.
That's actually flying arms into Nicaragua and dropping them to the Contras?
That's correct.
And I take it in furtherance of that activity, airplanes were purchased, an airstrip was purchased, and arms were continued to be purchased and transported to Nicaragua.
You're correct, sir.
And I take it that this part of the business therefore acquired certain assets.
You're right.
Now, was it your understanding that there would be any profit on the Contra resupply operation?
Not beyond the purchase of material.
And by material you mean arms?
Arms, yes.
And did you understand that you had any personal financial interest in the assets of the resupply operation?
The attitude that we had that once the so-called assets were purchased, they no longer belonged to us.
Now, I understand from what you've told us in deposition testimony that you were aware of a discussion by others, including General Secord, sometime in the fall or late summer of 1986, as to whether the assets of the resupply operation should be sold to the CIA or given to the CIA.
You're correct.
But would it also be correct to say that you did not concern yourself with that issue or involve yourself in the discussion of it?
It did not fall within the territory of my activity.
Did there come a time, Mr. Hakim, when Mr. Secord told you he'd been asked to become involved in the sale of arms to Iran?
Yes.
And did he describe this as part of a broader initiative to normalize relations between the United States and Iran?
Yes, sir.
And did it also involve an effort to release the hostages held in Lebanon?
That's also correct.
Now, again, who did he say asked him to become involved in this Iranian initiative?
This time it was very specific that it was on behest of the President.
And you agreed, I take it?
Definitely.
And you and General Secord did become involved in the transportation and sale of U.S. military equipment to Iran during the year 1986?
That's correct.
Did you come to learn who General Secord was reporting to in the U.S. government in connection with the Iranian initiative?
Most of it, not all of it. I could see that he was, if you like to refer to it as reporting, he was basically coordinating with Lieutenant Colonel North, but there were times that I learned that he had meetings with Lake Director Casey and Admiral Poindexter. These are the people that I learned that he had contact with. If he had any other person that he reported to, I'm not aware of.
And in connection with the Contra activity, did you come to learn who he was principally reporting to or coordinating with in the government there?
Lieutenant Colonel North.
When did you first meet Mr. North?
It was in connection with the Iranian initiative in February of 1986 in Frankfurt.
And did you thereafter come to know Lieutenant Colonel North?
I had learned quite a bit about Colonel North through General Secord prior to meeting him, and I was very anxious to meet him, and I continued to learn more about him as we worked together.
And did you work together with him and meet with him on several occasions after February of 1986?
Generally speaking, it is correct, but it was much later, after January 86.
Now, Mr. Hakim, I want to ask you some questions about the profits or surplus generated from the sale of arms to Iran. There has already been evidence at these hearings that in February and May of 1986, U.S. TOW missiles and Hawk spare parts were sold to Iran for a price of $25 million.
Yes, sir.
And it has also been testified to that the transaction was structured in such a way that of that $25 million, $8 million went to the CIA account in Switzerland, and $17 million went to accounts under your and General Secord's control in Switzerland.
That's correct, sir.
And it's been testified to that there were some expenses that needed to be paid out of the $17 million, but that I believe General Secord's testimony was approximately $14 million remained. And my question to you is this: what were you told that $14 million, more or less, was to be used for?
My understanding was that the income from these transactions were to be used to primarily assist the Contras, and also try to make the so-called the enterprise that we had created self-sustained and create a financial backbone for it, and as well as cover the expenses and other financial requirements attached to any business activity.
So you were told that the surplus was to be used for the Contras?
As well, yes.
To pay expenses in connection with the Iranian initiative?
That's correct.
And to generate capital for the continuing Iranian initiative?
You're correct, sir.
And were you ever told anything about any other purposes for this money?
Not in the form that we had a meeting sitting down and saying that this is the allocation. The impression that I got was from the remarks that General Secord made to me that basically came from such remarks as you don't know what Ali will need next, so we have to have money available.
And I take it from time to time you learned that Ali, that's Ali North, I take it?
That's correct.
That he did have need for the money for other purposes?
That's correct. There were several occasions.
And I take it one of them involved Motorola radios for a Caribbean country?
You're correct.
And another involved a ship for a special operation in the Mediterranean?
You're correct.
And another example would be cash that was required for DEA agents in connection with an effort to release the hostages.
You're correct on that too.
Now, We're going to get later on in your testimony to what has been referred to as the second channel. Excluding conversations relating to the second channel, were you ever told that any part of the profit or surplus from these first two sales in February and May to the government of Iran were to be for your personal benefit?
No, sir.
I take it that sometime in the summer of 1986, early summer, you did begin efforts to open up a second channel.
That's correct, sir.
And at that time, I take it there was some discussion of personal financial benefit to you.
That's right.
We will get to that later in your testimony. Would it be fair to say that you regarded yourself as being in some kind of an operation in which you, General Secord, and Oliver North each had different spheres of operation?
That was my understanding.
And North's was the political sphere,
That's correct.
and Secord's operational,
That's correct.
and yours financial.
That's correct.
And I take it in connection with both the Iranian and the Nicaraguan operation, in furtherance of your performance of your financial function, you caused certain companies to be created.
You're correct, sir.
And you also caused certain bank accounts to be set up in Switzerland.
Affirmative.
And to do this, you used your contacts with Mr. Zucker and CSF.
That's correct.
And you asked them to set up the companies and the bank accounts.
That's correct.
And I take it these companies were what we refer to as offshore companies.
As far as the United States is concerned, yes.
They were Panamanian companies
Amongst others, yes, mostly Panamanian.
and
I believe
African.
No,
Liberian?
Liberians, yes, yes.
And I take it these accounts were used to receive contributions that were being made by private parties and third countries for the benefit of the Contras.
As well as in the case of the Iranian initiative, the income from the sales of weapons, yes.
So the bank accounts were used to receive contributions for the Contras and the price received for the sale of arms to Iran.
You're correct, sir.
And then I take it out of these accounts were paid expenses of the Iranian operation,
That's right.
expenses for the benefit of the Contras,
Correct.
and various other kinds of expenses.
And procurements of arms for the Contras, yes.
I take it you set up a number of accounts,
You're correct, sir.
and you caused money to be moved from one account to the other.
Well, I instructed CSF to do that.
And they followed your
They
instructions.
followed my instructions, yes.
And I take it that one of your purposes in doing this was to create what you've referred to as confusion.
Correct. To lose the track of the movement of money.
Make it difficult for anyone else to find out how the money was moving.
Exactly.
And I take it one of the reasons that you set up bank accounts in Switzerland was to take advantage of the Swiss bank secrecy laws.
Definitely.
Now, was Oliver North's name on any of these accounts?
No, sir.
And was it on any of the companies?
No, sir.
Was Secord an authorized signatory on any of the accounts?
He definitely was not.
And was his name, to your knowledge and recollection, connected with any of the companies?
Not that I know of.
Now, at the outset, were you an authorized signatory on any of the accounts?
At one point, yes.
But at the outset, were you?
Yes.
And
At the beginning of the operation?
yes.
No, I was not.
But there came a time when you became an authorized signatory on some of the accounts, is that correct?
That is correct.
What was the reason that you became an authorized signatory?
With all due respect to a certain gentleman in CSF's organization, and I'm extremely thankful to CSF and Mrs. Zucker for the help they gave us, but there was a gentleman there that I cannot blame him. A covert activity, I could not explain to him everything, and he did not perform to my expectation, and unlike my style, I accepted to leave my signature on so I can turn the operation around, make it more efficient.
I take it the reason that neither Mr. North nor Mr. Secord were authorized signatories on the account was that you wanted to make it as difficult as possible for anyone to connect either of them with the financial operations of the account.
Well, that was one of the objectives, and the other objective was that it was not their function as it was agreed, and besides, they did not have any track record in Switzerland to be able to operate such financial network. You have to be known to the people, you have to be trusted.
I take it, all other things being equal, you would have preferred to have left your own name off those accounts.
Without any doubt.
And you only even associated your own name with them because of this problem you had with someone at CSF.
That's correct.
I take it when, if Mr. Secord wanted money to be moved out of one of these accounts, he then had to ask you to get it done for him.
You're correct, sir.
And you would then direct CSF to move the money.
Also, that's correct.
And if Mr. North wanted money moved from out of one of those accounts, he would have to tell Mr. Secord, and Mr. Secord would have to tell you.
That's correct.
I take it there was never an occasion on which you declined to follow one of General Secord's requests.
You're correct.
And to your knowledge, General Secord followed Colonel North's requests.
As far as I know, yes.
Mr. Hakim, you have made available to the committees certain records under immunity from the various bank accounts that you caused CSF to set up to manage and handle the money from the Iranian and Nicaraguan initiatives.
That's correct, sir.
And in addition to these bank records, which account for all the money in the accounts and all the money going out of these accounts, you also made available certain accounting records of CSF.
That's correct.
And these are accounting records that are efforts to account for the movement of the money in these bank accounts you've been testifying about.
That's correct, sir.
And you have also made certain other documents available to the committees relating to these accounts.
You're correct, sir.
And indeed, prior to providing them to the committees, you organized them in 7 notebooks.
Yes, I must say it was a very difficult task to achieve this because by design it was so structured that you could not collect the information, and my attorneys, Mr. Janis and Mr. Wexler, they went through a lot of hardship to put these things together with the assistance of accountants. It was a very difficult task to achieve.
Mr. Hakim, I'm going to ask you to turn to Exhibit 1 in the Book of Exhibits. Do you have that in front of you?
Yes, I do, Mr. Niels.
Now, is that a document which you provided recently to the committees?
I provided the original copy, yes.
And this original, I take it, was obtained from your home in California?
That's correct.
And that was quite recently?
That's also correct.
Now, I should state for the record that a copy of this document was found in Lieutenant Colonel North's office and appears in the Tower Board report. Can you tell us what this document is?
This document shows a business structure that I started to put together to increase the efficiency of our operation once I became aware that our activities were going to continue, and I structured it in such a way that there would be 3 collecting companies. That the reason I have here 3 collecting companies, the idea was after using collecting company A, namely Lake Resources, for a certain period of time, to abandon that company and that account and move on to the next one, so we will lose trace and track of the activity. And then further below, I created the operating companies, so we would be able to do proper accounting and allocation and get organized, which we never managed to do.
I take it this chart then describes, at least in a very rough way, what you envisioned as being a structure for the various companies and bank accounts that you had created.
That's correct.
And one of the reasons, again, that you had so many and that they performed different functions and that one would replace the other was that you wanted to make it as difficult as possible for anyone to trace money going in and out of these accounts.
Not only the money, but also the operation.
Now, I take it you have provided us with records from all of the companies on this chart and some additional companies.
That's correct.
And that would include bank records.
That's also correct.
Our, and when I say our, I mean the committees, both committees, accountants for both committees, have spent considerable time analyzing the records which you have made available to us, Mr. Hakim.
Yes, sir.
And they have prepared 2 charts. One of them is exhibit number 3, exhibit number 2, and the other is exhibit number 3. And the charts are also have been blown up and are behind me in the hearing room.
I have it in front of me.
The accountants who have been doing this work, there have been a number of them. There are 2 in the hearing room today, Mr. Lou Zanardi, who is standing, and Mr. Ed Haller, who is now standing. They have divided the monies flowing in and out of the accounts that you've made available to us into 2 charts. And they have done that based on Mr. Secord's testimony.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Secord testified that at the beginning of the Nicaraguan operation, contributions were being made to Mr. Calero's bank account in Florida, and that Mr. Calero was then paying the purchase price for the arms into one of your bank accounts.
Yes, sir.
And you were then paying for those arms out of that bank account, and the difference was effectively your commission or your profit.
Yes, sir.
And during that phase, when the contributions were going to Calero, and Calero was therefore paying you, the accountants have put that phase of the transaction in the chart marked Phase 1, which is Exhibit 2 in your exhibit book.
Yes, sir.
And if Mr. Zanardi would be willing to point, you'll see that there were receipts from Calero's bank account of $11.4 million, and this would cover the period roughly December 84 to July 85. There were expenses, either in the forms of the purchase price of arms or other related expenses of $8.6 million. There is an as yet unidentified transaction, which you and the committees are endeavoring to identify at this time, and we're optimistic we will be able to, of $0.6 million.
Yes, sir.
And there is a disbursement, which I will get to later, for the benefit of partners of $0.1 million.
Yes, sir.
That is a transfer to STTGI, which I take it was 50% owned by you and Mr. Secord.
Effectively, not to STTGI, to General Secord and myself, but effectively, if you'd like to refer to STTGI. Yes. It didn't enter the books of STTGI.
And that leaves remaining $2.1 million, 0.7 of which was remaining in your Swiss bank accounts as of July 1985, and 1.4 million of which are shown on your records as having left those banks and as having been recorded by your accountants as distributions to capital.
Yes, sir.
And we will get to that later. That covers the money going in and out of your Swiss bank accounts during Phase 1.
Yes, sir.
Now I'd like you to turn to Exhibit 3, which is the also blown up on the wall behind me. And that is a chart showing the money moving in and out of your Swiss bank accounts during Phase 2.
Yes, sir.
That covers, according to General Secord's testimony, a time when Oliver North had decided that the contributions should no longer be given to Calero, but should be placed in your bank accounts.
Yes, sir.
Arms were continued to be purchased and supplied to the Contras, but instead of the purchase price coming from Calero, it was paid for out of contributions that were put directly into your bank accounts.
That's correct.
It also includes receipts from the sale of arms to Iran.
Yes, sir.
And I should say for the record, well, let me stop and begin over. You'll see that the total receipts during Phase 2 are $35.6 million.
Yes, sir.
That covers 0.7 million, which was left in the bank at the end of Phase 1.
Yes, sir.
1.8 million received from private donors. 2 million received from third countries, and those, the private donors in third countries were contributions for the benefit of the Contras. And $31.1 million received for the sale of arms to Iran.
Yes, sir.
I should mention that that $31.1 million figure includes a $1 million deposit in November of 1985, which General Secord testified constituted an advance for transportation costs.
This is the Israeli payment?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Then you'll see there were disbursements directly out of the accounts in the amount of $26 million.
Yes, sir.
7.9, you and and the committee and General Secord have identified as disbursements for the benefit of the Contras. $14.4 million you and General Secord and the committees have identified as disbursements in connection with the Iranian arms initiative. That includes both the purchase price of arms and the cost of transportation and other incidental expenses. Point 9 have been identified by you and General Secord and the committees as expenses for miscellaneous projects at the request of Lieutenant Colonel North, and I think you've already testified about them here today.
Yes, sir.
$0.6 million have been identified as disbursements for the benefit of the partners, and that would include money transferred to STTGI and money transferred to STC, which is Stanford Technology in California.
Yes, sir.
And I take it Stanford Technology in California is a corporation that you are the sole owner of.
That is correct.
The total amount of money going to STTGI during Phase 1 and Phase 2 is just over $500,000. And since there's been testimony about this previously, I'm going to ask you now
the time to the enterprise, if you will, and its other activities, and the reflection of the income to STTGI can be seen in our books in STTGI, how it was dispersed and spent. But effectively, for the purpose of these hearings, I do not refer to them as loan.
you do not refer to them as loans.
No, sir.
I take it there was a time when STTGI had a line of credit with CSF.
That is correct.
But I take it that the loans made by CSF to STTGI were paid for out of these enterprise bank accounts.
That is correct.
And that is the reason you say that these are not loans, they are in effect transfers to STTGI.
That's correct, sir.
And I take it STTGI, some of the assets or resources of STTGI were used in furtherance of the Iranian initiative and the Nicaraguan initiative.
That's correct.
But you're not saying that there was $500,000 of expenses out of STTGI that needed to be reimbursed?
I logically know, but there came a time that we effectively lost all of our clients at STTGI, and the only thing that we were concentrating on was the U.S. government projects.
So instead of getting income from your, what would have been your other clients at STTGI, you took it out of the Iranian and Nicaraguan initiatives?
Precisely correct.
Now, the next item is denoted CIA arms, and that's $0.9 million. And I should state for the record that General Secord has identified disbursements of $2.1 million, which he has told us, told the committees, told the accountants, related to what was originally supposed to be a purchase of arms for the benefit of the Contras. Mr. Hakim, were those loans to STTGI or infusions of capital into STTGI?
It started out to be a loan, but for bookkeeping purposes, at this time, I would categorize it as infusion of money into STTGI for the services rendered at a time to the enterprise, if you will, and its other activities, and the reflection of the income to STTGI can be seen in our books in STTGI, how it was dispersed and spent. But effectively, for the purpose of these hearings, I do not refer to them as loan.
You do not refer to them as loans?
No, sir.
I take it there was a time when STTGI had a line of credit with CSF.
That is correct.
But I take it that the loans made by CSF to STTGI were paid for out of these enterprise bank accounts.
That is correct.
And that is the reason you say that these are not loans, they are in effect transfers to STTGI.
That's correct, sir.
And I take it STTGI, some of the assets or resources of STTGI were used in furtherance of the Iranian initiative and the Nicaraguan initiative.
That's correct.
But you're not saying that there was $500,000 of expenses out of STTGI that needed to be reimbursed?
I logically know, but there came a time that we effectively lost all of our clients at STTGI, and the only thing that we were concentrating on was the U.S. government projects.
So instead of getting income from what would have been your other clients at STTGI, you took it out of the Iranian and Nicaraguan initiatives?
Precisely correct.
Now, the next item is denoted CIA arms, and that's $0.9 million. And I should state for the record that General Secord has identified disbursements of $2.1 million, which he has told us, told the committees, told the accountants, related to what was originally supposed to be a purchase of arms for the benefit of the Contras, but which were instead eventually sold to the CIA for $1.2 million. That means that there was a loss on that transaction of $0.9 million, and that's why it appears on this chart as an expense of $0.9 million, and we have not allocated that to the Contras.
I understand that.
There is as yet unidentified transactions totaling $0.6 million, and there are general and administrative expenses. Some of these are payments to CSF, legal fees, and other kinds of general expenses which we have identified, but that don't relate to any particular transaction, and they amount to $0.7 million.
Yes, sir.
That leaves a difference between the amount into these accounts and the amount out for the expenses I have just identified of $11 million. $1.4 million remains, approximately $1.4 million, remains to this day in the bank accounts whose records you have provided to us.
Yes, sir.
And I take it those monies are now frozen to your knowledge.
To the best of my knowledge.
And that leaves a total of $9.6 million, which left these bank accounts and have been recorded on the accounting materials that you've made available to the committees, the CSF accounting materials, as distributions to the various capital accounts.
Yes, sir.
And what I would like to do now, Mr. Hakim, is to ask you about these capital accounts.
Yes, sir.
And the purpose of this exercise is to determine exactly what this $9.6 million represents.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Hakim, I guess I would first like you to turn to exhibit number 4.
Yes, sir.
These are accounting records compiled by CSF, which you made available to the committees. I take it that's correct.
That is correct, sir.
Now, Mr. Hakim, generally speaking, a capital account would be an account set up for distribution of profits to participants in a business venture.
Generally speaking.
However, you have told us after reviewing these records that some of the monies that the accountants allocated to the capital account were paid to third parties and constituted expenses of the enterprise.
That's correct, misallocation.
And I think I should say that the committees have verified that as to some of the amounts that were put in the capital account by your accountants, that you are correct. They were paid to third parties and appear to have been expenses of the Iranian or the Nicaraguan operation.
Yes, sir.
And I take it that your conclusion there is that these were simply errors by the accountants. Misallocations.
Misallocations, because again it was a covert activity. I could not explain everything to them, so I cannot really blame them.
And you have also told the committees that some of the monies in these capital accounts were in fact simply monies that were put in the custody of CSF for investment purposes, but which were essentially monies set aside for the continuing operations of the Iranian initiative.
That's correct.
We will return to those in greater detail.
Okay.
And you have told us that the remaining amounts that were allocated to these capital accounts were in fact distributions of profit to the various venturers in the enterprise.
That's also correct.
And I will get into some more detail in a moment, but first I want to ask you some questions about where this money is right now. I take it that some of the money in these capital accounts constitute investments which are being managed by CSF today.
That's correct.
And you've made available some other records which show that the total amount currently being managed by CSF is $6.67 million.
That's correct. That excludes the 1.4 that we already talked about.
Some of the monies you've already testified to were dispersed to third parties as expenses of the enterprise, and they're gone.
Yes, sir.
And some of the monies were dispersed to personal bank accounts of the venturers, including yourself.
That's correct.
And those are also gone.
Yes, that's correct.
Where is the $6.67 million now?
The latest information that we have from CSF, this money is with Toronto Dominion Securities London.
London?
Yes, sir.
And do you know where it has been between November of 1986 and today?
I have no idea, sir. The records that you have should show that movement. I'm sure it shows where they have been invested.
But you don't know?
No, I have no idea.
And I take it, did there come a time that you caused that money to be moved from this country to London or from Switzerland to London?
If you refer to the documents that I have provided you, you will see that these monies were scattered all over the world in various investments. And when the so-called Iran Gate revelation came about, my understanding is that CSF made an effort to remove the various investments from wherever they were and consolidate that and keep it under one umbrella.
Okay, I'd like to turn back now to exhibit number 4.
Yes, sir.
There are 5 capital accounts listed in exhibit number 4. The first one is titled Albert Hakim. I take it that's self-explanatory and refers to you.
That's correct.
The number opposite your name is $6.8 million.
Correct.
I take it that, according to the testimony you've previously given, that 6.8 does not all represent distribution of profit to you.
That's correct.
We'll get into more detail in a moment, but at least $4 million of that amount, according to your testimony, reflects money set aside for the purposes of the enterprise.
That's correct.
Mr. Neal, may I interrupt? The House of Representatives is now in progress with a vote, and so House members will absent themselves. Please proceed.
The second capital account is titled Coral Assets.
Yes, sir.
What does that refer to?
Coral Assets is a company that was available at CSF for a different purpose that I used to accumulate the portion of the profits that were intended for General Secord. So this effectively reflects the portions of the commissions that were set aside for General Secord.
Mr. Hakim, did you continue to make deposits, so to speak, into the Coral Assets capital account through August of 1986?
That's correct.
Did there ever come a time when you stopped making deposits into that account?
When we had no more income.
Now, when you reviewed the records prior to your testimony, do you recall noticing that there were a number of occasions on which, on the same day, a certain amount of money allocated to these capital accounts was divided into 4 groups? And if you took the total amount as 100, 30 would go in one account, 30 in a second account, 30 in a third account, and 10 in a fourth account.
That's correct.
And the 30s would go into Hakim, Coral, and CT, and the 10 would go into SciTech.
That's correct.
And these amounts can be found, if one looks for them, in exhibit number 5.
Yes, sir.
And I'm not asking you to look for them right now. But you recall that there was an amount of approximately $860,000 that was divided in this fashion in August of 1986.
Yes, I do recall that.
And approximately $258,000 was put in the Coral account, $258,000 in the Hakim account, $258,000 in the CT account, and about a third that much, about $86,000 in the SciTech account.
That's correct.
What do those splits, including that last one, represent?
Well, 1/3 was put into Albert Hakim's account for my benefit. The second 1/3 Coral Assets for General Secord's, and 1/3 to the CT account that represents Tom Klein's account, and the 10% went to SciTech, which if you look at the complete name of SciTech, it's SciTech trading group, and if you separate SCI from TECH, you will notice that the abbreviation will form again STTGI, and this was chosen by design to reflect the offshore company of STTGI. That was my design and my idea.
And were these divisions of profits?
Yes, sir.
And were they divisions of profits on the procurement of arms for the Contras?
That's correct.
And I take it what you're saying is that 30% would go to Albert Hakim's account, 30% to Coral Assets, which is Secord's account, 30% to CT, which is Tom Klein's account, and 10% to SciTech, which in effect was the mirror image of STTGI overseas.
That's correct.
And referring your attention again to the split that was distributed to these accounts in August of 1986, what did that represent?
This is the income from the sales of weapons that we refer to as the stranded arms. This I learned during the deposition that it was the merchandise that was finally sold to the CIA.
And this was merchandise originally purchased for the Contras?
To the best of my recollection, we had made a down payment to take advantage of delivery, and there came a time that we had to decide whether to forego the down payment or procure them, and it was intended for the Contras, and we decided to purchase them.
And did you have a discussion with any of your partners about the size of the commission that you would pay yourselves in connection with this transaction?
I wouldn't call it a discussion. I can say that I, together with Mr. Klein's, thought that it would be proper, since this was taking a lot of our effort, and it was the last transaction in connection with the Contras, to have a higher profit margin. We mentioned that to General Secord. General Secord looked at us with his normal icy face, and he said that he will make the decision when he decides what he's going to do with it. From there on, I really had no further information, except that I knew General Secord was not agreeable to increasing the profit margin.
But I take it, did he make the decision about how much profit would be distributed on that transaction?
He always had that authority, yes.
And so he was the one who made the decision to distribute $861,000 profit on that transaction?
To the best of my knowledge, yes.
And that was distributed in August of 1986, 30-30, 30-10, to the 4 capital accounts that you've identified?
That's what the records show, yes.
What was the reason, your capital account is in your own name, and General Secord's is in the name of Coral Assets. What was the reason for that?
Well, actually 2 reasons. Once you have the money in a corporation, it's easier for a fiduciary company such as CSF to manage it. They have the directors of the companies close to them, and they can move the monies for higher profits as the occasion arises. And the second reason is to eliminate any personal contact to those funds.
So that General Secord's name would not be connected with the money?
Well, that was my recommendation, and he accepted that.
Now, did there come a time when General Secord told you, well, did there come a time when he, in some fashion or another, renounced his interest in the profits from the Contra arms sales?
Yes, it did occur.
When was that?
To the best of my recollection, it was during the first half of '86, early '86, if I'm not mistaken.
And what did he say?
I should explain, it occurred at a time that we were caught between both projects. That's why I think it was in early '86. Both the Nicaraguan and the Iranian projects were going through very tense moments, and General Secord was not happy with the efficiency of the support that he was getting from the government, and he had never, in my opinion, even to this date, divorced himself from the government, and he said that he still got energy left and he should go back to the government and try to straighten things out. Therefore, he doesn't want to have any attachment to this money that may make it difficult for him to go back to the government.
But I take it you continued nonetheless to put the money in the Coral capital account for him.
I continued to do that basically with the rationale that I knew there was no offer to General Secord, at least as much as I knew, to go back to the government, and I was not quite sure if that would occur or not, so I did not change my pattern. I continued as before.
I think the record should reflect that unlike some of these other accounts, we have been able to determine no withdrawals from the Coral assets account as of this date. Mr. Hakim has supplied records showing the current balance in the Coral account. Now you have, going down to the next account, CT, I think you've indicated that that relates to Tom Klein's.
That's correct.
And that's where the account into which his share of the profits was put?
That's correct.
And what is the significance of the letters and words CT?
C stands for Klein's, and then the TEA, again, another creation of mine for T, Thomas.
So you reversed his initials?
That's correct.
And then you used a word T instead of the initial?
That's correct.
And you've already testified that SciTech was in effect an offshore version of STTGI. I take it that means that you regarded it as being beneficially owned equally by you and General Secord.
For the purpose of these hearings, that's correct.
Well, is it true?
It is true, yes.
And I take it that some of the money put into the SciTech account was used to pay expenses of business ventures of STTGI, which were unrelated to the Iranian or Nicaraguan initiatives.
That's correct.
And I take it some of the money put in the SciTech account was used to make investments for the joint benefit of you and General Secord.
That's also correct.
And that includes, among others, a $150,000 that went out of the SciTech account to try American arms.
That's correct.
Now, the last account is the Button account. It has $200,000 in it, and your records reflect that that amount was put in the Button account on May 20th, 1986. Is Button short for something?
In this case, no. The name button actually came as a result of a joke between Mr. Zucker and myself at a time that we were having a discussion. The complete name is Belly Button, and this was a name that I decided to use at a time because we laughed about the joke, and simply took the name and used it for this set-aside.
Does it refer to a person?
Yes, it does.
Who?
Lieutenant Colonel North.
Now, can you explain the circumstances surrounding the setting up of a account for Lieutenant Colonel North?
I must start by saying that when I established this account, Lieutenant Colonel North had absolutely no idea about this. This occurred during the time that the so-called McFarland-Tehran trip was about to take place. And
that took place in approximately the 24th, 25th of May, 1986, and this account was set up on May 20th.
But I'm talking about time that the concept and idea came to my mind. We knew that such a trip was going to take place. And by this time, I had become extremely fond of Lieutenant Colonel North. To me, he's an amazing person. I noticed something in this man that he's got two loves. One is his country, and to a point that is, in my mind, the biggest satisfaction that can be given to him if he would enter into an environment that he could get killed for his country. I sense that so many times. And the other love that he has is his family, and especially during the time of the Second Channel, I witnessed him being torn apart between these two loves. But coming back to how this thing came about, I came up with the idea that Ali had to be insured, and started out with putting this money aside as death benefit for him. And I had also learned through scattered discussions, it was not that there was one discussion that this issue was analyzed. I had heard through various remarks that Ali was not spending time at home, and he was not attending to his family, to his kids' education, and so forth. And I had come emotionally very attached to Ali, still am, and really love this man. I talked to Richard, General Secord, that I said that I thought it would be wise to set aside $500,000 to cover as a death benefit for Ali. I recall that Richard opposed to this figure.
Richard what?
Opposed.
Was against it?
Against this, yes. As a matter of fact, he made a remark that the point of reference that I use is my own lifestyle, and I have no understanding of what a soldier's life is, and that there are benefits that the government provides. And I came up with a figure of 200. General Secord made no opposition to this. He did not disagree, and yet he did not come right out and say that, fine, go ahead and do it. And I did not pursue this. That's how this was developed, and the reason I came up with this figure, in addition to the fact that General Secord had opposed to my original idea, I figured that the interest on $200,000 could cover a good part of a child's university education.
Did you tell Colonel North that you'd set this money aside?
I cannot recall having ever told Colonel North that I have set money aside for his family's benefit. But I do recall my reaction to the times that we were discussing his family problem, basically for not being able to attend to his family, and also his concern about the education of his kids, and his concern what would happen if he should get killed and so on. The way I remarked to him was, Ali, you are part of the family. For as long as one of us is alive, you need not to worry about your family. That's what I remember having told him. I do not recall ever sitting him down and said that I have set aside $200,000 for your family's benefit.
Now, you've referred to this at times as a death benefit. I take it this was shortly before the trip to Tehran in May of 1986?
You're correct.
You've also said some things about his children's education. Did you ever take any steps to get some part of this money or any other money into his possession for his children's education?
Well, the answer is yes. I consulted Mr. Zucker, and I gave him an Iranian proverb. I told him that I want to do this, but the proverb is that if you want to fix the eyebrow, we don't want to blind the eye, meaning that I want to find a proper way of getting this money to his kid without compromising Ali's position or his family. And consequently, we came to the conclusion that Mr. Zucker, during his forthcoming trip to the United States, to contact Mrs. North without mentioning my name, to tell her that there is a certain person who admires the husband and wishes to help out with the university and education expenses of the children. And I provided him with the telephone number, home telephone number of Mrs. North, and I was told later that Mr. Zucker did call Mrs. North, and as a result of that, a meeting took place in, I believe, in Mr. Zucker's attorney's offices in Philadelphia.
Did Mr. Zucker tell you anything about what happened during that meeting?
What I can recall, the purpose of his meeting was to learn more about the family structure of Mr. and Mrs. North, to see who is who, what the family structure is, who are the relatives. I have never met Mrs. North or any of the children, and I do not have any personal knowledge to this date about Colonel North's family structure. Bill Zucker basically wanted to learn about the family, and when I asked him, he said that he has an idea about the family structure, and I believe what he had in mind was to see if he could find a proper way of getting the money in some sort of fashion which was never determined through the relatives to North's family. And the bottom line of that investigation was that he could not find a proper way to do that.
Did you and Mr. Zucker ever talk about another way to do that?
Yes, I was persistent, and I had additional discussion with Mrs. Zucker. The idea that we came up with was maybe we could arrange for a part-time job for Mrs. North, and since we did not know what the qualifications of Mrs. North were, we decided that maybe if Mr. Zucker could find someone that could offer that position to her, and even if she did not qualify, we could make use of the button set aside to cover her salary. And Mr. Zucker told me that he knew of a real estate developer that he was going to contact and see if he could find a way approaching the problem that way. And that was the last time we discussed about this issue, and to the best of my knowledge, no money was sent to North's family, and no proper solution was found.
Just so we understand, the idea of this real estate development company was to have that company pay Mrs. North some kind of a salary and to have the button account pay the real estate company.
That's correct.
Now, you've indicated that you told Mr. Zucker not to tell Mrs. North what the source of this money was.
That's correct.
But I take it Mr. North knew who Mr. Zucker was.
Yes, he did.
Now,
although they had not met.
And did you mention to anyone else the fact that you had given Mr. Zucker the North's telephone number?
I believe I told this to General Secord, that this is what I was doing.
Now, Mr. Hakim, I have to ask you this question. Since you've testified that you told Mr. Zucker not to mention your name, were you attempting to compromise Mr. North without his knowledge, or did you act in the belief that this wouldn't happen unless that the meeting would never take place in Philadelphia unless Mr. North knew of it and approved of it?
I did not absolutely have had the intention of compromising Oliver North in any way or form. Basically, what I did, I put a wheel into motion, and then if North's family wanted to open the door to my motion, they could. If they wanted to close the door to it, they also could do that. I just simply went ahead and put this action into motion and left the rest up to them.
I think you said you put the wheels in motion. I take it you're referring to the fact that you gave Mr. Zucker the telephone number.
That's correct.
Requested him to try to set up a meeting with Mrs. North. Told General Secord what you were doing, and you assumed that the transaction would go forward if the Norths were agreeable and not otherwise.
That's correct. And to answer the second part of your question, my intention was only to help. I had no other intention.
Mr. Hakim, I'd like to return to the Hakim capital account. The Hakim capital account itself
What exhibit is that?
is Exhibit 6. I do not propose to go through every transaction entered in that account with you, Mr. Hakim. You have identified in depositions out of this account a minimum of some $700,000, which constituted profit or distributions to your personal benefit.
That's correct.
You have identified several other $100,000 that you're uncertain of.
That's also correct.
You've identified $500,000 entry, which was intended to be used for the joint benefit of you and General Secord.
Yeah, I refer to that as the answer is correct. That was the investment money that we set aside, yes.
I would particularly like to direct your attention to two entries on the third page of the exhibit. One of them, each of them is in the amount of $2 million. The first one is opposite a date 5/3, and I take it that's March 5th, 1986.
Yes, that is correct, yes.
These are European datings, are they not?
Right.
So that the 5, which appears first, refers to the day of the month, and the 3 refers to the month.
You're correct.
What was the purpose of that $2 million transfer into your capital account?
Well, this is the money that General Secord referred to as the self-insurance money. My approach was a little bit more expanded than General Secord's. If you recall from the organization chart that I prepared, Exhibit 1, there is a section that refers to CSF investment with letter R, which stands for reserve. So this is this set aside for reserve, which could cover insurance needs, capital for the company. It's just reserve.
You were setting aside capital for the company and giving it to CSF to invest so it would make money.
That is correct.
Was this, I take it that as a general matter, when CSF manages money on behalf of a client, it enters into some kind of an agreement, an investment management agreement with that client.
That's correct.
And you indeed have entered into investment management agreement with CSF for your personal monies. You have executed one at least at some time.
Yes.
We'll get back to that.
Yes. Okay.
Was this $2 million transfer into your capital account the subject of a separate investment management agreement?
Yes, it was.
And I'll ask you to turn to Exhibit 17 and ask you whether that, in fact, is the investment management agreement that relates to this $2 million.
Yes, it is.
And that also is a document that you have provided to the committee.
That's also correct.
And this one came from CSF, I take it,
That's correct.
and you had your own copy of it in your own files.
That's correct.
And it refers particularly to the assets described in Appendix A, and if you turn to Appendix A, it refers to deposit on March 5th, 1986, US dollars, $2 million.
That's correct.
And that's the same $2 million that shows up in your capital account on that same date.
That's correct.
Now, this $2 million, however, I think you've testified was set aside for the purposes of the enterprise. And if you, this was not just for your personal benefit.
That's correct, sir.
And that created a problem in your mind, as I understand it, in the event that something happened to you, for example, if you were to die.
Yes. And
Because there would be no record of the fact that this should be under the control of the enterprise rather than under your personal control or in your estate.
you're correct, sir.
And did you execute some kind of document in order to handle that problem?
Yes, I did.
I'd like you to turn to Exhibit 18. Do you have that in front of you?
Yes, I do.
Is that the document that you executed in order to deal with the problem of your death and the control over this $2 million?
That's correct, sir.
Approximately when was this document executed?
To the best of my recollection, it was sometimes between March and June, I think, when we tried to restructure this date.
March or June of 1986?
Correct.
In other words, sometime after the money had been put in this sub-account and prior to June.
That's my best guess.
Now, the document in the first paragraph refers to the fact that you might die, and the second paragraph reads as follows: should Richard V. Secord, I'm sorry, I should say it refers in the first paragraph to the fact that should you die, Secord would then control the money in the account.
Yes, sir.
And then in the second paragraph it says, should Richard V. Secord, after having qualified to give us instructions concerning this account, die or become disabled or otherwise be unable to communicate with us, a decision we shall make in our best judgment. We shall then accept instructions with respect to this account from Oliver North alone, both with respect to the investment of assets and the payment of funds from the account, whether to him or to any third party or parties he shall designate.
Yes, sir.
And I take it your idea here was that if anything should happen to you, General Secord would control the account, and if anything happened to him, Oliver North would control the account.
Yeah, we went up the ladder, yes.
With North at the top of the ladder, Secord in the middle, and you at the bottom.
That's correct, sir.
And I take it the idea was you wanted to keep, the higher the person was on the ladder, the farther you wanted to keep him away from the money in these accounts, or having his name associated with them.
That's correct.
But you still had to have it associated in some document, otherwise you might lose control of the $2 million?
It lose the control of the $2 million for the enterprise.
And this was an enterprise ultimately in which North was at the top.
That's correct. That was my judgment.
Okay, I'd like you to refer back to Exhibit 6. I'd like you to refer back to Exhibit 6. There is a second $2 million entry. This one dated June 18, 1986. Do you have that in front of you?
Yes, I do.
And was that also the subject of a separate investment management agreement with CSF?
That's correct.
And I believe that is Exhibit 19. I'll ask you to turn to Exhibit 19.
I have that.
And is that the investment management agreement that relates to the $2 million that was put into your capital account on June 18, 1986?
That's correct.
And it is headed AH sub-account number 2. And I think the record should reflect that the earlier investment management agreement covering the other $2 million was denominated AH sub-account number 1.
That's correct.
And again, the attachment to Exhibit 19, the appendix, rather, I should say, Appendix A, refers to a deposit on June 18, 1986 in the amount of $2 million.
That's correct.
And I guess I should ask you, what was the purpose of this $2 million being put in your capital account?
Generally the same information I gave you. It was the enterprise's money for the expenses, reserve, backup, and what I call the financial backbone of the company to expand and strengthen the financial backbone of the company.
Now, was there one of these documents covering the contingency of your death in connection with this second $2 million?
Yeah, there should be a similar document.
Take a look at Exhibit 20.
I have that, sir.
Now, Exhibit 20 is similar to the other document that was executed in the event of your death, except that it does not mention Lieutenant Colonel North. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And what was the reason for not having North's name on this document?
We had created certain obligations in connection with opening the second channel that would not have been appropriate for a government official to get involved in handling those commitments.
These were commitments to officials or people you believe to be officials of the Iranian government?
As well as businessmen.
Both.
Yes.
And when you say commitments, you mean that you had an obligation to pay them some money?
That's putting it very bluntly, yes.
But accurately?
Yes.
And I take it from what you're saying that one of the purposes of this second $2 million sub-account was that it could be used for that purpose.
Well, it was company expense, so those commitments, I regarded them as company expense.
I'd like you to turn back to Exhibit 18 for just a moment.
That's 16.
And I'd like you to turn to the second page. This is the document which makes reference to you, General Secord, and Colonel North. Do you have it in front of you?
Yes, sir.
Turn to the second.
It says on the first full paragraph on the second page, should none of the three individuals named above be alive, then upon receipt of proof of death and form satisfactory to us, we shall divide the then remaining balance in this account in 3 equal parts of equal value, and hold one such part for the designees of that individual, if he shall have left a written designation with us, or if he shall not, we shall pay that part to the properly designated representative of his estate.
Yes, sir.
What was the reason for putting that provision in?
Well, I, again, went through different stages. I provided here that if they wanted to designate this to, let's take the case of Colonel North, if he became aware that there was, he had such power over this money, if he wanted to designate that to a branch of U.S. government, he could do so. And if he died, then my understanding was, and I will not go into details about this at this time, that this private enterprise had 3 people running it, as the 3 circles that we refer to. So that was my personal judgment to prepare the document as you read it.
To your knowledge, was Colonel North aware of the fact that if the 3 of you all died, that a third of this $2 million would go to his estate?
He's never seen this document, and I never discussed it with him.
Is the answer that, to your knowledge, he was not aware of the way?
To
in
my
which
knowledge, he was not aware of it.
Mr. Hakim, we've been testifying, or you've been testifying about money up until now. Did there come a time when you actually became involved, substantively involved in what has been referred to as the Iranian initiative?
Yes, I did, sir.
And was that at first in February of 1986?
That is correct.
And how did that come about?
I believe I was in Geneva when I received a call from General Secord. I can't recall at this time where he was calling from. It was he was not in the States, I believe. I'm not quite sure. He told me that he needed my assistance in connection with the, by then I knew the code name for Mr. Orbanifar. We refer to him as Orba, in connection with that activity, and he wanted to see me in Frankfurt. So I had less than 24 hours to appear there. And he also asked me to make reservation for, I believe, 3 or 4 people at the hotel at the airport, which I did. And I got there first, and I met with General Secord there, and upon his arrival, he explained to me that certain activities were going on in connection with Iran, which I did not have the details of it until that day. He explained to me that there was a prior effort which I knew very little about, and he needed me to help him to interpret and act as the translator in the meetings that they had arranged prior to their coming. And he also mentioned to me that Colonel North would be coming soon, and a CIA official will also be coming soon. He explained to me about the various participants that will be arriving shortly, including the gentleman I mentioned earlier, Mr. Ghorbanifar, and who would be bringing with him several Iranian officials, and he wanted me to participate in those meetings that they intended to have.
Did an issue arise about you and Mr. Ghorbanifar?
The issue of Mr. Ghorbanifar was discussed earlier between General Secord and I.
And was the point there that you already knew Mr. Ghorbanifar, and you understood that he did not want you at the meeting?
Yes.
And I take it General Secord told you that he wanted you to come anyway?
That's also correct.
And what was the reason?
I started to tell you that the issue of Mr. Ghorbanifar had come before this meeting between General Secord and myself. He had asked me earlier if I knew a gentleman by the name of Mr. Ghorbanifar. I told him yes, I did, and I explained to him how. He told me that I'm making a mistake, it's not the same person. And at some later date, he told me that he had mentioned my name to Mr. Ghorbanifar, and had told him that I would be participating with him in the meetings, and Mr. Ghorbanifar violently rejected the idea and told him that I was an enemy of the state and in no way I should get involved. During the Frankfurt meeting, when I arrived there, I asked him, okay, Richard, how are you going to solve this problem? I know Mr. Ghorbanifar, I have met him in the past. I'm sure he will recognize me. By this time, Oliver North had arrived and the gentleman from the CIA. They discussed among themselves if the CIA could, the CIA station in Frankfurt could provide me with some facility that Mr. Ghorbanifar would not recognize me. And if I'm not mistaken, the CIA official even made some phone calls, and he came back and said, well, the bureaucracy is not going to allow us enough time to take care of this. And Richard told me that, Albert, you have shown that you're resourceful. Why don't you go and solve the problem? and they wanted me back in just a little bit more than an hour. So I rushed down to the concierge of the Sheraton Hotel. I told him I needed to buy a gift for my father, and I had in mind to buy him a wig, because I could not explain to the young lady there why I needed a wig. I got the address of several locations in town. I took a taxi, went there, went to the first one, and I had a heck of a time because I was in a rush to get back, and this lady was asking me questions whether I wanted to swim or I didn't want to swim, what kind of wig I wanted. It was difficult to keep a straight face and also be efficient and get back in time for the meeting. I managed to get the wig, and she insisted that I should go down to the barbershop and get the hairdo. Anyway, to make the long story short, I came back, and when General Secord and Colonel North looked at me, they could not believe their eyes. They said that in no way Mr. Ghorbanifar would recognize me. And
I take it you then attended the meetings with Mr. Ghorbanifar wearing this wig?
Face to face. Yes.
And he did not, to your knowledge, recognize you?
That's correct.
And I take it the reason you were there was to act as an interpreter?
Yes, I was introduced as a special interpreter for the President of the United States to impress the Iranians.
Now, can you describe, I don't want to go into the entire meeting, Mr. Hakim. We have heard testimony about it before, but the committee would like to hear from you how the interpretation aspect of the meeting was handled. And I guess my first question is, was someone other than you doing the interpretation at the beginning of the meeting?
First of all, I attended two different meetings, and one was the so-called the political, and the other one the military. During
the political one, I take it, was attended by officials of the government of Iran and,
yes,
and officials of the U.S. government.
That's correct.
And I take it this was the first meeting of officials of both governments in some time.
That is correct.
Okay, continue.
Basically, we agreed that I come in and sit there and allow Mr. Ghorbanifar to do the translation, and I just stay there and see how he does. I was introduced to them, and he knew that I spoke Farsi. I greeted them in Farsi and spoke a little bit in Farsi. So Mr. Ghorbanifar started with the translation, and there came a time that I decided that I should no longer take the passive role and should interfere, because right in front of my two eyes and my two ears, the translation was taking a direction that was serving Mr. Ghorbanifar purposes best. So I had to take a more active part.
Was he accurately translating what the Iranian officials were saying?
There were many times that he was not accurately translating. So I sort of took charge there and started to do the translation. And soon after a few minutes, I found out that what the American delegation was saying and what the Iranian delegation was saying, they were absolutely on two different frequencies. They were going past each other.
In what fashion?
Well, Colonel North was heading the U.S. delegation, and his emphasis was to take steps that would take us to establishing a relationship with Iran, normalizing the relationship. He was after a long-term objective, and at the same time he was referring to removal of obstacles, and that the obstacles he meant the hostages. But the approach of Colonel North was long-term, where the approach of the Iranian official was highly, if not only, focused on purchase of weapon. And I would bring him around and get him close to talk about the same thing. They would continue for a short while to discuss about the long-term relationship, but before I knew it, they were back, each one to what I called back to their own frequencies. And I didn't see the meeting going well. I didn't have a good feeling about it, because I was convinced that the gentleman who came from Iran had a definite requirement, and he did not want to divert his attention from the requirement that he had. And later on, my assessment proved to be correct.
Now, after this meeting, did you return home to the United States? I don't mean immediately, Mr. Hakim, I mean eventually.
Yes, eventually I did came back to the United States, yes.
And did you for a time have direct telephone conversations with the Iranian official?
Yes, but prior to that, I ran into the gentleman in the lobby of the hotel. He had a personal message for me to carry to the President of the United States. He approached me, and General Secord was also present, and we had a very short discussion in the lobby. And the cultural difference became so evident during this short and brief discussion that I gave even less of a chance of success with the approach that we were taking. The message was, if I could whisper into the ears of President Reagan to go ahead and for whatever money is needed to supply the arms. This may not be meaningful to the committee, not...
What do you mean by for whatever money?
He basically was trying to bypass all the people and make a deal with the president. And if the president...
For money?
Yeah, if, tell him that money is no problem, and if he could get the weapons given to them and make a deal.
And I take it this was an example of the point you made before, that the two sides were on totally different frequencies.
It's the culture gap is, at least with this gentleman, and once we got to the second channel, it was totally a different world. I was very impressed with the second channel.
And after you returned to the United States, did you have some direct communications with this first channel?
Yes, a number of telephone conversations.
What was the reason for that? Why did you have direct communications with him?
The explanation that was given to me was that the CIA continued to have the problem of coming up with someone to replace me. And I was not willing to really go beyond my expertise, which is business, and get involved into politics. But since they had no one yet assigned to this project, I continue to maintain contact with this individual, and there came a time that I was replaced.
Replaced by a CIA person who could speak Farsi.
That is correct.
You've made repeated reference to the second channel. Did there come a time when you decided to seek a second avenue to Iran?
Yes, it did.
And that means, I take it, find a government official in Iran to try to deal with, different from the government official who you'd met in Frankfurt in February.
That is correct, but the focus was to choose as you very well know, this structure of the Iranian government is such that there are different groups and factions with different approaches, and yet they do work in harmony and closely. My mission was to see if I could choose a channel that a more professional communication could start between the two countries. So it was not just to find another channel, but a channel that healthy discussions could take place.
Mr. Hakim, I'm not going to ask you any more questions about this second channel today. We'll pick up again with it when you return tomorrow.
At this time, the Chair recognizes Mr. Van Cleve to continue the interrogation. With the conclusion of Mr. Van Cleve, we will stand in recess until 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, at which time we will receive the testimony of a Mr. Lewis. And at 1:30 tomorrow afternoon, we will resume the testimony of Mr. Hakim.
Thank you.
These lawyers can't be here in the morning. Just want to say that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Mr. Hakim.
Good afternoon to you, sir.
By prior agreement with Mr. Niels, in order to provide continuity in the testimony before the committee, I'm going to limit my questioning of you today to one particular subject, and then I hope that when Mr. Niels finishes his questioning of you during your next appearance, then to come back to some of the other issues that have been raised during your testimony. Tonight, the subject that I'd like to cover with you is the subject of the connection between your enterprise and Oliver North.
Yes, sir.
And what I'm going to do, just so you have a general outline of how the questioning will proceed, is to ask you a series of specific questions that are similar about a couple of particular areas. I'm going to start with what you call the wills.
Yes, sir.
I'm going to go from there to the fiduciary agreements. I'm going to go from there to the button account, and I'm going to conclude by asking some questions about the question of your plan for education of one of North's children.
Yes, sir.
So with that general plan in mind, this is the way the questioning will go. This first group of questions refers to exhibits AH-18 and AH-20, which have been called testamentary instructions or wills in previous testimony before the committee. And you're welcome to refer to them, although the questions I have are general in nature. But if you need to refer to them at any point or confer with your attorney, please stop me.
Thank you.
Okay, with that background, during the period January 1, 1985 to the present, did Oliver North request, suggest, or direct that exhibit AH-18 or AH-20 be prepared?
No, sir.
During the period January 1, 1985 to the present, did Oliver North suggest, request, or direct that his name be included in Exhibit AH-18, AH-20, or any similar document?
No, sir.
During the period January 1, 1985 to the present, did you tell Oliver North, orally or in writing, or by any other means, that Exhibit AH-18, AH-20, or any similar document had been prepared or executed?
Not that I can recall, sir.
Not that you can recall.
Yes.
You have no specific information about whether or not North may have been told by anyone.
It's possible that he was told by General Secord, but not through me.
When you say it's possible, can you give the committee any additional information on that point?
General Secord was aware, I made him aware of these so-called wills,
Both of them?
both of them.
He was aware of them?
Yes, sir.
And when you say it's possible he may have told Colonel North, do you have any specific information on that point?
No, sir.
Did you intend to confer on Oliver North any personal financial interest or personal financial gain by executing Exhibit AH-18, AH-20, or any similar document?
I'm afraid I don't understand the question. Could you rephrase that, please?
I'd be happy to try and either repeat it if you'd like, or...
Could you rephrase it, please?
All right. My question is, did you, Mr. Hakim, intend in executing Exhibit AH-18, AH-20, to confer a personal financial benefit on Oliver North?
Not beyond what's provided in the document. That is, in the case that all the three of us die, then his family would benefit from it, provided that he has not designated anything else.
I understand the terms of the provision, but my question was the document executed in order to further his business for the United States government or to provide personal financial gain for him?
I think the document speaks for itself, and I think he's just answered that question.
Mr. Hakim, do you want to?
I really don't have anything further to say.
Okay. I'd like to turn now to the fiduciary agreements. These are Exhibits AH-17, AH-19, and AH-21. And my questions to you, Mr. Hakim, are going to be similar to the questions I put with respect to the testamentary instructions.
Yes, sir.
During the period July 1, 1984 to the present, did Oliver North ever request, suggest, or direct that any of the fiduciary agreements contained in Exhibits AH-17, AH-19, or AH-21 be established?
No, sir.
During the period July 1, 1984 to the present, did Oliver North ever request, suggest, or direct that any of the AH capital accounts which were made subject to the fiduciary agreements in AH-17, AH-19, or AH-21 be established?
These are the AH sub-accounts.
Yes.
No.
During the period July 1, 1984 to the present, did you tell Oliver North, orally or in writing, or by any other means, that Exhibit AH-17, AH-19, or AH-21, or any similar agreement had been established?
No, sir.
To your knowledge, during the period July 1, 1984 to the present, did Richard Secord or anyone else tell Oliver North that the agreements established in Exhibit AH-17, AH-19, or AH-21 had been made?
Not that I'm aware.
Did you intend to confer on Oliver North any personal financial interest or personal financial gain by executing Exhibit AH-17, AH-19, or AH-21?
No, sir.
These questions refer to Exhibit 26, the fiduciary agreement in favor of B. Button that has been referred to generally in earlier testimony. And again, the questions will be similar, Mr. Hakim, although these questions are not quite identical to the previous questions.
Yes, sir.
You have testified that this account, or at least the underlying capital account, was established to provide death benefits for the family of Oliver North in the event that something happened to him in Iran. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Did Oliver North, during the period January 1, 1985 to the present, ever request, suggest, or direct that the underlying capital account, or Exhibit 26, be established?
The answer is no, and I'd like to further explain. If you refer to page 5, you see that this document is not signed. It's not an executed document. It doesn't have any signature on it.
Right. Okay. We'll note that for the record. This is a related question, but it does not deal with Exhibit 26 itself. And it goes, did Oliver North, during the period January 1, 1985 to the present, ever request, suggest, or direct that a capital account or similar type of reserve or set-aside be established for his benefit?
No, sir.
During the period January 1, 1985 to the present, did you tell Oliver North, orally or in writing, that a reserve, capital account, or other similar set-aside had been established for his benefit?
Not more than what I testified during the questioning of Mr. Niels.
You testified in response to Mr. Niels that you told Oliver North that his family would be looked after in the event that anything happened to him. Is that correct?
I believe I said that if any of us would remain alive out of the 3, he needs not to worry about the family.
Did he ever ask you for any such assurance?
No, he didn't.
Did you tell him anything further whatsoever about how you would try to assist his family?
I didn't, and he didn't ask.
So it would have been reasonable for him, I take it, to think you were making a general statement that was essentially a purely moral commitment.
That is correct.
Okay, I'd like to turn now, if I might, to the last of the 4 issues that I mentioned, and that has to do with the gift for the education of one of North's children. You testified that during 1986 you considered making a gift to Oliver North or his family to pay for the college tuition of one of his children, correct?
That is correct, sir.
You also testified that you instructed your attorney, Mr. Zucker, to see if there was some way this could be accomplished, correct?
That's also correct.
And your attorney told you, did he not, after some investigation, that you should not get involved. Is that correct?
That is, he said that he has not found a proper way and I should not pursue this.
And he told you this because he could not determine a lawful means to make the gift. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So the gift was never made. Is that correct?
To the best of my knowledge.
Okay. And in fact, at your deposition on May 24th, I think you were asked the following questions, which I'm about to read to you, and gave the following answers. If you just confirm that for the committee. You were asked this question: to your knowledge, did any of the money of the enterprise ever go to the benefit, personal benefit of Oliver North? And you gave this answer, correct? Not under my instructions and not to my knowledge. Is that correct?
That is correct, sir.
You gave that answer in response to that question.
That is correct.
Thank you. Did you ever tell Oliver North that you or the enterprise were going to make a large gift to him, or that you were thinking about doing that?
Not beyond what I already testified.
Okay. Did you ever ask anyone else to tell North that you were going to make such a gift, or were thinking about doing it?
Not beyond what I already testified.
But my recollection is that you have not testified that you told anyone else other than Mr. Zucker to discuss this subject with either Mr. or Mrs. North. Is that correct?
I also mentioned about the education gift to Mr. General Secord, if you
But that was not my question, Mr. Hakim. My
And I
question was, did you tell anyone else to tell Mr. or Mrs. North that you were thinking of making a gift?
No.
Did Oliver North ever complain to you about financial troubles and state or imply that he would like you to make such a gift to him or his family?
No, sir.
Now, I believe you testified that your attorney, Mr. Zucker, met with Mrs. North in the process of investigating this gift. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And is it a fact that you instructed your attorney, Mr. Zucker, not to identify you as his client?
That's correct.
So it is entirely possible that if Mr. Zucker carried out your instructions, until today, Mrs. North did not know who it was that intended to make a gift. Is that correct?
It's very possible.
And is it a fact that you and Mr. Zucker were looking for a way to provide income to Mrs. North so that even she would not know the source of the income?
That was the intention.
And is this the reason why you did not want to make a direct gift so that the Norths would not know the source of the gift?
That's correct.
In other words, you wanted to make an anonymous gift so that you could not be accused of influencing North. Is that correct?
Well, the answer is yes, but I'm not quite sure if I understand the spirit of your question.
Well, I didn't think the question had a spirit, Mr. Hakim. I thought it was a factual question. And the question was, you wanted to make an anonymous gift. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And the purpose of making an anonymous gift was so that you could not be accused of influencing the Norths. Is that correct?
That's correct.
You testified that your motive in contemplating a gift to Oliver North's family was to help his family. Is that correct?
That's right.
Did you have any other reason for considering this gift?
No, sir.
Didn't you think making this gift would give you influence over Colonel North?
If he didn't know where it came from, the answer is I could not have influenced him in any way or form.
Mr. Hakim, did anyone ever tell you that it would not be lawful to make a large gift to a United States government employee with whom you were doing business at the time?
I knew that.
Just a couple of final questions, Mr. Hakim. During the period from July 1, 1984 to the present, Mr. Hakim, did you ever give money or any other thing of value to Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North or any member of his family?
No, sir.
During the period from July 1, 1984 to the present, Mr. Hakim, did you ever request or instruct any person to give money or any other thing of value to Lieutenant Colonel North or his family?
No, sir.
To your knowledge, Mr. Hakim, during the period July 1, 1984 to the present, did anyone connected with any business venture of yours or with the Iran-Contra arms sales ever give money or any other thing of value to Lieutenant Colonel North or his family?
No, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I have no further questions at this time.
The panel will stand in recess until 10 a.m. tomorrow morning.
Thank you.
That was not